Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for coming all the way to Niigata to participate in the G7 high-level corporate governance roundtable. I am Masato Kanda, the Vice Minister of Finance and the Chair of the OECD Corporate Governance Committee. To start the roundtable, I'd like to invite our three distinguished speakers to address the audience with some opening remarks. Please join me in welcoming first Shunichi Suzuki, Minister of Finance and Minister of State for Financial Services, Japan, and Matthias Cormann, Secretary General of the OECD, and Giancarlo Giorgetti, Minister of Economy and Finance, Italy. Please welcome them with a round of applause. First of all, Minister Shunichi Suzuki will deliver welcoming remarks on behalf of Japan. He will speak in Japanese, so please use your earphone to hear the English translation. So, Minister Suzuki, floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the introduction. I am Minister of Finance and Minister of State for Financial Services. My name is Shunichi Suzuki. Thank you very much today for coming to Niigata. On behalf of Japan's G7 presidency, we are very pleased to welcome all of you. I hope that the G7 High-Level Corporate Governance Roundtable will provide a good opportunity to have a candid and open discussion about various initiatives in corporate governance. Let me briefly talk about Japanese corporate governance reform. We have strived to lead corporate governance reforms to enhance long-term corporate value. As part of the reforms, we introduced the National Corporate Governance Code, which refers to the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance. We have also promoted companies' efforts through 2 revisions to the Corporate Governance Code in Japan. Through these efforts, recent years have brought significant progress on corporate governance. Our next challenge include how to ensure effective corporate governance is attained. In September last year, in his speech delivered at the New York Stock Exchange, Prime Minister Kishida highlighted that we will accelerate and further strengthen Japan's corporate governance reforms. Since then, the Financial Services Agency has arranged several consultation meetings to get input from investors and other market participants. Last month, we published the Action Program for Corporate Governance Reform. The action program pulls together a broad set of policy measures, mainly from 2 perspectives. First, it is important to change the mindset of companies and investors in a sustainable way in order to raise corporate value. Second, management and boards should be mindful of sustainability as well as profitability and growth potential. When it comes to sustainability-oriented management, the disclosure of sustainability, including of human capital, is a priority for the G7 agenda. We, in our G7 presidency role, will take the lead in advancing this discussion. Going forward, it will be important to implement each measure of the action program in a steadfast manner. The Japanese government will deepen dialogue with companies and investors and push forward initiatives for corporate governance reforms. In addition, Japan will continue to actively participate in the global agenda for corporate governance reforms. As Secretary General Cormann may mention later, I think, the OECD Corporate Governance Committee, chaired by Japan's Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs, Mr. Kanda, is currently working to review the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance. We will also continue to contribute to corporate governance reform in Asia, including through the OECD Asia Roundtable, which has a solid track record of more than 20 years. Last but not least, I would like to conclude my remarks by expressing my best wishes for your continued prosperity and development. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister Suzuki. Next, OECD Secretary General Matthias Coman will deliver his opening remarks. So, Matthias, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Minister Suzuki, Minister Giorgetti, Vice Minister Kanda, distinguished guests, colleagues. Firstly, thank you to the Japanese G7 presidency and also the Japan Financial Services Agency for hosting today's high-level corporate governance roundtable. At the OECD, we greatly appreciate Japan's leadership on this issue, including, and in particular, the outstanding contribution Vice Minister Kanda has made and continues to make as the chair of the OECD Corporate Governance Committee. Good corporate governance has always been fundamental to ensuring efficient, effective and well-functioning capital markets. This includes, of course, facilitating access to market finance at reasonable costs, which encourages economic growth and innovation. Recent developments have also highlighted the relevance of corporate governance for other economic and social policy objectives, and that's where the ongoing review of the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance reflect these broader linkages. First, on sustainability. Robust corporate governance frameworks can help ensure companies have the incentives and oversight to contribute to the sustainable transformation of our economies. This is, of course, in investors' best interests. Climate change is considered to be a material financial risk for listed companies that account for 2/3 of global market capitalization, which is why the revised principles promote the disclosure of sustainability-related information in a way that is consistent, comparable, and reliable. They also facilitate dialogue between a company, its shareholders, and stakeholders on sustainability matters relevant to the company's strategy. And they highlight the board's responsibility to consider sustainability when providing oversight over governance practices, strategy, risk management, and internal control. Second, on ensuring financial market integrity and resilience. Recent failures and disruptions in the financial sector expose some weaknesses in supervisory oversight. Good corporate governance helps ensure market integrity by providing shareholders and other market participants with the information they need, promoting accountability through appropriate checks and balances. The revised principles will help guard against shortfalls in corporate governance by encouraging sound risk management frameworks and ultimately the protection of investors. They emphasize the role of the board in assessing whether a company's capital structure is compatible with its defined strategic goals, with oversight that can help identify excessive risk. The revised principles also aim to improve disclosure on bond covenants and provide more clarity on bondholder rights. As Vice Minister Kanda, I'm sure, will share in detail, the revision process for the principles is advancing very well. We intend to put them to the OECD ministers' meeting for adoption next month, ahead of what we hope will be the endorsement by G20 finance ministers and central bank governors at our next meeting in July. Thank you very much to all of you who have been strongly engaged in and supporting this process. The revised principles, we believe, are a big step forward in our efforts to strengthen corporate governance further, to strengthen global growth while encouraging private sector action on climate change and fostering financial stability. So thank you very much, Minister Suzuki, for giving me the opportunity to say a few words, and thank you again, Masato, for all your outstanding work on this.
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary General Coman. Last but not least, Minister Giancarlo Giorgetti will deliver his remarks. So you have the floor, please.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank the Minister Suzuki, the Vice Minister of International Affairs, Tomoko Haya, and the Chairman of the Corporate Governance Committee, Masato Kanda, for the invitation, and those who organized this event, as well as those who are here today. I would also exploit this opportunity to thank the OECD and, in particular, the Committee on Corporate Governance for the valuable work it is doing on the revision of the G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. This initiative started with the support of the G20 under Italian presidency in 2021. I am happy to see the concrete result of this support and that the review has been completed. I look forward to the endorsement by G20 finance ministers and central governors in July and by the leaders in September. This is the third review of the principles of the ones that took place in 2004 and 2015. Indeed, the principles have to be kept updated and to be adapted to changes in economy and society worldwide, including the consequences of the COVID-19 and the structural developments in capital markets and corporate governance practice that have emerged since the last review. In particular, this last review includes, among other priority areas, recommendations concerning the sustainability and resilience of companies and addressing increasing corporate concentration. Corporate governance has also been evolving in Italy, and Italy is taking some further steps to address the issues holding back in its capital markets, many of which were highlighted by the OECD in its capital market review of Italy in 2020. Indeed, the Italian Council of Ministers has recently approved a bill introducing measures to support Italian capital market competitiveness and growth, taking into account the recommendation of the Capital Market Review of Italy and the consultation conducted further to the Green Book prepared by the Ministry. Regarding sustainability, the Corporate Governance Code for listed companies, published in 2020, encouraged companies to adopt strategies and practices increasingly oriented towards sustainability and has directed them to pursue the groundbreaking concept of sustainable success. This is a driver toward a long-term sustainable growth. Today, we are here to discuss how corporate governance can support corporation long-term performance and impacts as well as their sustainability and resilience. I reckon that, on the basis of such a wide international consensus, the revised principles of corporate governance would act as a fundamental compass to orient us and how to intervene to strengthen our corporate governance framework. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister Giorgetti. Indeed, sound and good corporate governance is essential for corporations that need to navigate the rapidly changing business environment following the COVID-19 pandemic. We therefore strongly appreciate the work that the OECD has been doing to improve the sustainability and resilience of corporate governance frameworks, and I hope that we may count on support from all G7 countries. The keynote speakers may now leave the room if necessary for their appointment. However, if your time permits, we hope you will stay. So please join me in a big round of applause for excellencies for our distinguished speakers. Now, I'd like to move on to the discussion part of the high-level corporate governance roundtable. Let me introduce the moderator, presenters, and panelists. The moderator is Carmine De Noia, OECD Director for Financial and Enterprise Affairs. The presenters are Patricia Poland from the US Treasury and Toshitake Inoue from the Japanese Financial Services Agency, and myself. The distinguished panelists are Kelly Waring, Chief Executive Officer, International Corporate Governance Network, Toby Rose, co-founder Kaname Capital, and Luca Enrique, Professor of Corporate Law, University of Oxford, and Monica de Bergis, Chairwoman, SNAM SPA. I wish to also thank for additional distinguished discussants for joining us today. With this introduction, I'd now like to turn the role of chair over to Carmine De Noia. Carmine, thank you very much indeed for facilitating the roundtable. So over to you.
Thank you, Masato, and so good afternoon, all distinguished panelists and discussants. It's a great pleasure to moderate this important roundtable, taking advantage of the opportunity provided by the G7 Finance Minister and Central Governors meeting under Japan G7 presidency. I would also like to thank all the participants for joining the discussion today. So one of the three strategic priorities of the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance is actually to support sustainability and resilience in the corporate sector. And this is exactly what we will discuss today. So sustainability risks and opportunities for companies have been topical issues in the area of corporate governance. These developments also highlight the need to pay more attention to the resilience of companies as well as markets and how good corporate governance can address these issues, which, by the way, were flagged also in the introductory remarks. So today, actually, we will have three brief presentations from the global and jurisdictional perspectives, and then we will ask the four panelists to deliver initial remarks. After that, actually, we will open the floor and welcome the perspectives of all discussants. So let's move to the presentations, and first, Masato, also in his role as Chair of the Corporate Governance Committee, will outline the revision of the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance. So, Masato, over to you.
Thank you very much, Carmine, dear distinguished speakers and G7 colleagues. It's a pleasure to present the revisions to the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance. Next, please. Yes. I'd like to start with an overview of the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance. The principles are the single global standard in the area of corporate governance. They were endorsed by G20 leaders and have been also endorsed by the Financial Stability Board as one of its key standards for sound financial systems, and they are used by the World Bank for national assessments as well. The role of the principles is to help policymakers to evaluate and improve the legal, regulatory, and institutional framework for corporate governance. And 53 jurisdictions have adhered to the principles, including all G20 and all FSB members. As you can see in this slide, they have 6 pillars, including a new one upon sustainability and resilience, which I will get back to. Next, please. The review started following a request by the G20 leaders at the Rome summit in Italy in October 2021. We aim to have the revised principles endorsed by G20 leaders at the summit in this September in New Delhi, following the OECD ministerial meeting and the G20 finance ministers and central bank governance meetings. The objectives of the revision is to update the principles in light of recent evolutions in capital markets and corporate governance practices. This includes a structural decline in the number of listed companies, the increase in asset under management held by institutional investors with the use of passive index investment strategies, and investors' increased focus upon material sustainability risks and opportunities. You can see the 10 priorities below areas the Corporate Governance Committee identified for the review. Next, please. Now, I'd like to outline some of the main revisions to the principles. First, the revisions include important changes to the introductory framework to the principles, in particular to better reflect the 3 strategic priorities, which are to promote access to finance, innovation, and entrepreneurship, to provide a framework to protect investors, and to support corporate sector sustainability and resilience. The biggest overall change in the revision is the addition of a new chapter on sustainability and resilience. This chapter brings together guidance on corporate governance issues from a cross-cutting perspective, and it addresses corporate disclosure, shareholders, boards, and stakeholders. The revisions promote sustainability-related disclosure and the use of international recognized standards that facilitate the comparability of disclosure across companies and markets. The revisions also seek to provide guidance on the concept of materiality. The revised principles also clarify that material sustainability risks and opportunities must be considered by the board and highlight the importance for the board of long-term thinking. In addition, the revisions seek to promote dialogue between the company, its shareholders, and stakeholders on sustainability matters. Next, please. The revised principles also include other important changes. First, they aim to promote a clear regulatory framework for company groups, including by increasing disclosure of capital structures, group structures, and the control arrangement in company groups. Another important topic is the growing use of digital technologies and the need to take into account these evolutions, both in supervisory practices as well as regulatory frameworks. The revised principles also promote remote participation in shareholder meetings with proper conduct. The revisions also addresses the important role of institutional investors and stewardship, including the growing use of stewardship codes as a tool to encourage shareholder engagement. Concerning board responsibilities and duties, revisions include strengthened recommendations on the growing use of board committees and diversity consideration. There is also a new emphasis on risk management as well. Finally, the principles propose a new recommendation to address the increasing importance and impact of corporate debt and bondholders in markets and the rights of bondholders. Ladies and gentlemen, sustainability and resilience are key to creating long-term value, and good corporate governance plays a key role in this. I therefore look forward to today's discussion on the role of corporate governance in supporting corporations' sustainability and resilience and long-term sustained growth. Thank you very much indeed. Carmine.
Thank you, Masato, for this broad presentation on all the main points that also are in the revision and the reasons for that. So next, Patricia Pollard will describe the U.S. international engagement with corporate governance issues at the OECD. So Trish, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and let me begin by thanking the Japanese presidency and the OECD for holding this roundtable. I think this is an incredibly important topic, and as we lead up to the G20 meeting in July, I think this is a really useful conversation to have. Let me start also by voicing the support of the U.S. for the important work of the OECD Committee on Corporate Governance. The G20 OECD principles are the internationally recognized standards for effective corporate governance, and the U.S. Treasury strongly supports the revisions to the principles. I'd like to especially thank Masato and his OECD colleagues for their excellent leadership in this latest review. From our perspective, at the most basic level, the principles of corporate governance aim to address issues that can stem from the classic principal-agent problem, the division between owners and managers of publicly listed companies. Sound corporate governance is essential to properly align incentives, offering transparency and accountability that allows for the efficient allocation of capital and thereby supporting economic growth. Over the past 2 years, the OECD Corporate Governance Committee has been updating the principles. The committee's worthy goal is to provide governance on important emerging issues in corporate governance while preserving their role as a broad consensus standard on corporate governance best practices. And I think it's very clear that the updated principles meet this goal. So I want to highlight 3 aspects of the revisions. That is on sustainability, digitalization, and changes in public listings. The revisions speak to the increased relevance of sustainability considerations. Investors are demanding more and higher quality information to inform their decision-making on sustainability-related matters, and climate risks are increasingly salient to companies. And as Secretary General Corman just mentioned, it is generally expected or respected that it is in the company's best interest to address sustainability concerns. The principles also speak to an uptick in digital technology use by corporations. This has implications for both investor engagement and for the management of digital security risks. And the principles also speak to the decline in the number of companies going public. The principles do so by highlighting the need to improve public capital access while preserving the highest standards of investor protection. We believe that the principles help to address these emerging issues while maintaining the basic corporate governance framework, with its broad relevance across jurisdictions. While addressing new issues, the revised principles remain faithful to the key function of corporate governance as addressing the principal agent problem. They recognize that jurisdictions will use different combinations of policies to promote sound corporate governance, and they encompass the range of approaches in use that promote similar outcomes, so they can provide a robust reference point for a range of jurisdictions and a range of approaches. And they balance the demands placed on publicly listed firms against the need to encourage more listings and greater capital formation. Better access to equity markets can help strengthen the balance sheets of corporations and provide opportunities for investors, especially retail investors, to share in the returns on capital. We at the U.S. Treasury commend the OECD Committee's work on the principles, and we look forward to supporting their adoption by G7, G20, and OECD members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trish. And finally, Yoshitake will present the recent efforts by Japanese government on the development of corporate governance reforms, which I think is we have seen in the last year. So Toshitake, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karumine-san. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to introduce corporate governance reform in Japan, especially some unique features of a reform and what we will do to further advance the reform. By sharing our experiences, I would like to provide my fellow participants with food for thought to deepen our discussion today. Next slide, please. Firstly, I would like to introduce 4 unique features of corporate governance reform in Japan. First, it has been led by the government. The current corporate governance reform was initiated in 2013 as a part of government's growth strategy by late Prime Minister Abe. The Financial Services Agency first formulated the Stewardship Code in 2014. We formulated the Corporate Governance Code in 2015 together with the Tokyo Stock Exchange, taking into consideration the OECD principles. Second, it has been focused on growth-oriented governance. In many countries, the corporate governance system has been traditionally regarded as a mechanism where the board oversees the executives to ensure they do not take excessive risks. At the outset of our reform, the Japanese companies have been suffering from more than a decade of low growth, despite accumulating uninvested retained earnings. In order to overcome that challenge, we have positioned corporate governance as a trigger for sustainable corporate growth by encouraging the management to take appropriate risks through effective board oversight and constructive shareholder engagement. Third, we have been reviewing the reform periodically. After initially formulating the 2 cores, the government created a follow-up council of experts in order to review the progress of the reform on an ongoing basis. Based on the review, the cores have been revised twice each with a 3-year cycle. As a result, we have made significant progress in the form of corporate governance, for example, in increasing the number of independent board directors and successfully changed the mindset of companies' management. In 2021, we revised the Corporate Governance Code to incorporate principles on sustainability issues. Fourth, we are now at the stage of moving our focus from form to substance. Sufficient results cannot be expected only by satisfying form. For instance, changes in the board composition alone do not immediately lead to positive corporate performance. Now is the time to increase effectiveness of independent directors to enhance management's awareness of growth and sustainability. Next slide, please. Let's move on to the second slide, which explains what we will do to further advance the reform. We have reviewed the progress of the reform and formulated the action program for accelerating corporate governance reform last month. This action program aims to enhance our corporate governance reform from form to substance by instilling changes the company's management's mind and culture. The action program has 4 major pillars. The first, encouraging the management to have an awareness of profit-making and growth. For example, we encourage management to properly consider cost of capital, business portfolio optimization, or investment in human capital. Second, increasing the awareness of sustainability. We would like to promote best practices on sustainability disclosure, including on workforce investment. The enhanced transparency encourages companies to take appropriate actions on sustainability issues. Also, it is important to improve the diversity of the board and core human resources, such as increasing the percentage of female executives, targeting 30% by 2030. Third, improving the effectiveness of independent directors. For example, we can promote educational activities on roles expected of independent directors so that they can take proper actions expected by market participants. Fourth, enhancing the effectiveness of stewardship activities. The measures include making sure asset managers allocate sufficient resources to stewardship activities and providing incentives for stewardship activities. We are committed to the continued corporate governance reform by steadily implementing the measures in this program. For details of the program, please refer to the material distributed on your table. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Yoshitake, and also for all the work that has been done in all these years. And I still remember an Asian Roundtable in Tokyo with some of you where we were already discussing some of the features. Now, so I would like to turn to our four distinguished panelists. Now, to each panelist, I will pose one question related to today's discussion topic. So we start with Kerry Waring. So Kerry, as a CEO of ICGN, the International Corporate Governance Network, but also as a member of the Council of Experts concerning the follow-up of Japan's stewardship and code and Japan Corporate Governance Code. So what are your thoughts on the reform so far, and evaluation from your point of view? What are the future governance reform priorities that you see in Japan and also elsewhere from your point of observation? Please.
Thank you very much, Carmine and Vice Minister Kanda-san. Congratulations to you, Serdar, and the OECD team on the revisions to the G20 OECD principles, which will really serve the world well as we navigate the next decade and strive to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And while it's important to focus attention on the systemic events of our time, let us celebrate the importance of strong governance as the foundation for successful corporate performance. Fairness, accountability, responsibility, and transparency are the pillars upon which financial value is preserved and enhanced, allowing our economies to thrive and people to prosper. The OECD principles encapsulate this and precede ICGN's own global governance principles, first published in 2001, and used by ICGN members, who today collectively represent around 77 trillion of assets under management, in their voting policies and company engagements. Last year, both the OECD and the ICGN principles were cited in the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive as authoritative global frameworks of governance information of most relevance to users. The directive is transposed into reporting standards mandatory for over 50,000 EU companies from January next year. So I'm delighted to be here today, given my role on the Council of Experts, and acknowledge significant reforms led by the FSA, JPX, and others in Japan over the last decade. For companies, we continue to focus on board diversity and the effectiveness of independent directors in overseeing corporate performance, resilience, growth, and sustainability. This includes oversight of capital allocation, cross-shareholdings, executive remuneration, and human capital management. For shareholders, the heat is on asset owners, including listed companies with their own pension funds, to effectively oversee asset manager stewardship activities, including investee company monitoring, voting, and engagement. There is enhanced scrutiny on the governance of investors themselves, unbiased leadership, conflicts of interest, remuneration, and commitment to resources. And there is increased focus around the importance of sustainability. Last year, the ICGN and the UN-supported Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance published the model mandate, which sets out example contractual terms for asset owners to consider when embedding governance, stewardship, and sustainability objectives into investment management agreements. So we encourage constructive dialogue between companies and investors. Sustainability impacts on a company, particularly climate-related, should be integrated with financial statements so investors can properly assess and price risk, opportunity, and resilience. But to do this well, we need globally harmonized corporate sustainability reporting standards as developed by the ISSB and EFRAG to enable high quality, consistent and comparable disclosure. Alongside this, we welcome efforts by the IAASB in developing a global assurance framework to help verify the reliability of this information. And in Japan, the SSBJ has enhanced the content, format and timeliness of governance and sustainability information. ICGN advocates that this should be consolidated into the securities report and published in English 30 days ahead of the AGM. But look, disclosure is not an end in itself. It's the start of a conversation, and regulators should mitigate any obstacles which inhibit this, removing barriers to collective engagement to avoid investors breaching concert party rules, abolishing dual-class share structures which limit effective stewardship by giving controlling owners powers disproportionate to their economic interests, and eradicating greenwashing, which obscures the accuracy of information in corporate reports, ratings, and investment products. To conclude, the path towards corporate governance excellence is a journey, it is not a destination. And while there is no one-size-fits-all approach, the OECD and ICGM principles provide globally recognized frameworks to guide companies and investors in their mutual objective to preserve and enhance long-term corporate value upon which we all rely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerry, also for your kind words. Toby, so you have a long experience in investing in Japanese companies, so what role also do you think investors can have in improving corporate governance further in Japan, and we heard Kerry, in a way that supports long-term sustainable growth, please?
Thank you. It's an honor to be in such distinguished company. I've been thinking about governance in Japan since the formation of the initial corporate governance code. And one of the friction points in Japan that is obvious to any investor is this economy for a long time has been optimized for harmony and stability and not really optimized for growth. And we have to be honest about that. And so the leading question is we're being invited to be agents of change and how to be agents of change. But I want to be very clear. Investors can't make things grow. We hold management teams accountable for return. So that the key foundational statement that I'm making is that investors, through accountability, are making sure that assets are being run properly, owned by the right owner, human capital is optimized, and that the end goal is return, and that return fuels growth. With that, it's with a great honor that I sit in front of Mr. Yamaji, the head of the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and I congratulate you for your initiative on the price to book of less than 1. Presently, over half of Japanese companies have a price to book of less than 1. For those not familiar with finance, it basically means that the management team has defaulted on their cost of equity. And it needs to be seen as such. And what we're talking about today is really how to engage with management teams that have failed. And we at Konami Capital think very deeply about the Japanese culture. And in fact, we're quite supportive of lifetime employment. But we think that the only segment of the Japanese working population that should not have lifetime employment are CEOs, C-suite, and board members. Their tenure is a function of an election, and that election happens at a general shareholder meeting. We'd like to return the general shareholder meeting as the asset of shareholders. So with that, I'd like to offer up 4 examples of things that the man in the market does. 2 of them, I think, are our promise to Japan, and 2 are areas that we'd like to see some improvement. The first is, as an asset manager, my promise is to try and collect the best asset owner to support us. The only way you can have a proper investment time horizon is if you're managing money that is durable. Hot money is the plague of all markets. Speculation is fueled by short-term money, investment is fueled by more patient capital. Our commitment is through more patient capital, selecting our asset owners wisely allows us to have the durability to engage with management and have a real conversation about years 2, 3, and 4, as opposed to quarters 2, 3, and 4. The second point that I would make is that as a fundamental investor, we have a concentrated portfolio of 20 names. Our top 10 names are 50% of our portfolio. We are not owning the index. We are allocating capital in this market. I mean, no offense, but an index is not a fiduciary. Somebody who meets management, goes to the factory, has a dialogue about what could be better is a fiduciary. Lastly, I'd like to focus on 2 points where I think that there's room for improvement. The OECD new guidelines are extraordinary. The focus on resilience and sustainability, I think, is really quite interesting. As the man engaging with companies, we have a very interesting holding in a marine, a diesel power company that should be moving forward with next generation fuels, ammonia, hydrogen, but legacy relationships, particularly with Toyota, are holding them back from making the right steps. The entrenchment of this management team and their mindset of their legacy technology doesn't allow us to help them bridge to the future. Another example is this equity market in Japan is presently about 8% held by the Bank of Japan. Apparently, these holdings are for policy reasons, and we would ask the Bank of Japan to respect that policy structure and kindly abstain from all voting. And by abstaining from all voting, minority interest shareholders' voices will be better heard at the AGM. With that, I'll conclude by saying Warren Buffett and his AGM mentioned Japan more times than he's ever mentioned it. Smart money is coming here, and we are very optimistic and bullish about Japan.
Thank you, Toby, and also Warren. And so Luca Enriquez, Luca, recent market developments have tested the resilience of financial institutions and the financial system more generally. So how do you think that good corporate governance can contribute to it, so to the resilience of institutions, but also companies more generally, and as well as society as a whole, which is also one of the aim of the principle. Professor Enriquez, please.
Thank you very much, Carmine. I'll try to respond in my 4 minutes by saying that, first of all, the banks that failed in the last few months all displayed some similar dysfunctional governance features. So there's something to see there, and I will get to that. But that's hardly a surprise. They wouldn't have failed had they had good governance. What is surprising, I think, is that market players and regulators keep learning and unlearning the lessons about the relevance of governance. A few years are enough of good times for us to forget that banks are fragile and economies are fragile too. So perhaps we didn't help, luckily, that in the last 3 tumultuous years, we had a real-world COVID stress test, let's call it. So the COVID test was passed with flying colors by the financial system. And of course, complacency is the danger. So recent bank failure and the related turmoil reminded us the hard way the clear lessons that we had learned from the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, namely that good governance matters. How? First, as multiple empirical studies have proved, strong risk management practices and oversight make a big difference. And I don't have time to consider these studies, but there are a few of them that are quite convincing. Second, other studies have shown that banks with governance more centered on shareholders and profitability did worse during the crisis, and so that affected the bank's resilience negatively. Finally, although I must say the empirical evidence on this is at best inconclusive, legal scholars, for once, I may cite them, have emphasized that the board independence is nothing without expertise. You cannot monitor effectively what you do not understand. That we had learned. And as the Fed's post-mortem on Silicon Valley Bank clearly highlights in its report, these three elements, that is deficient risk management, excessive focus on profitability on the bottom line, and insufficient board expertise were at the root of that bank's failure and arguably the other banks' failures that we have witnessed recently. Of course, together with regulators and supervisory mistakes. Broadening the scope to non-financial companies, we find similar empirical evidence in studies on firms' resilience in the face of COVID. So, for instance, there is a study by Albuquerque and others that found a correlation between firms' positive performance in the spring of 2020 and higher environmental and social ratings. There's an interesting study by Lee and co-authors that correlates the quality of a firm's culture as measured by them with the help of machine learning techniques with a better response to COVID-19. To sum up, good governance supports resilience if it ensures a strong corporate culture and ethics, sound risk management practices, and avoiding an exclusive focus on financial performance. But I must end with a caveat. Only in an ideal world can resilience and profitability, or resilience and growth, go together seamlessly. Perhaps in the long run, that may be the case, but we all know what we are in the long run. Here and now, trade-offs are real. And in fact, if you think of it, building resilience means having spare capacity, redundancy of risk controls, higher capital ratios, and so on. And that's costly. And only firms that are well protected from competition or are compelled by regulation to invest in resilience can do so without a concern for what their competitors do, and therefore for their own survival. If you have competitors, building resilience can cost you dear on product markets unless your competitors also prioritize resilience. But how do you know? So the implications are clear. At the board level as well as at the level of policymakers, the balance between resilience and profitability / growth is very hard to strike. And getting it wrong on the side of too much resilience, as perhaps the experience of our host country shows based on what I heard, can make resilience non-resilient itself. Awareness to this is thus itself part of how good governance practices and policies can contribute to resilience. Thank you.
Grazie. Thank you, Luca, also for reminding us that the strongest independence, I think, in corporations, in regulators everywhere comes from competence and expertise. And I mean, I have here the first sentence. I mean, all of us, I think, they know of the letter of Michael Barr dealing with the report on SVB. SVB failed because of a textbook case of mismanagement by the bank. Senior leadership failed to manage basic interest rate liquidity risk. Its board of directors failed to oversee senior leadership and hold them accountable. And so, talking about this, Monica De Vigis, chairwoman of SNAM, an important, Italian listed companies, and Europe leading operator in natural gas transport and storage, as well as also you are member of many boards of many listed companies around. So how do you see actually the role of the board in ensuring that material sustainability risks and opportunities are considered by the companies they serve? And also, how do you describe a more empowered board? So how does the board chair, and is your role, play into that? Monica, please.
Thank you for the question. So in my opinion, everything starts with the perspective of the board. The perspective in terms of time horizon, so focusing both on performance, short term, but also on transformation, long term. I was also touch about risk oversight practice, and then business judgment rule before answering to the question of the role of the chair in this empowered governance. So the perspective of the board, so for a long time, the boards, they have focused more on performance and protecting the interest of the shareholders. The future was more predictable, the change was lower, and the changes, they were less radical as today. It was kind of possible to project the future based on the past. It has become apparent that it is becoming urgent and critical that the boards, they focus on simultaneously on short and long term, on performance and creating new value for the business of the society. At the point that at every board meeting, you should have a section on short term, a section on long term. This concept has to sit on a robust risk oversight practice. And with this, I don't mean risk management, because this is a management in charge of risk management, but I don't mean either designing policies and procedures. So risk oversight requires a deep understanding of the type and the magnitude of the company principal risk. Within the board, a clear line of responsibility across the committees, a regular and transparent dialogue with the management using the same risk dashboard that the management uses, the same detailed risk dashboard that the companies uses. And then, as you said, Toby, not all the risk can be prevented. So the board, even in good times, need to practice the muscle of crisis management in order to be ready when the time comes. And then in this context of increased complexity in decision-making, in time lag between the decision today and the results the day after tomorrow, in a situation where the board discloses much more to the external world and to the stakeholders, the risk for the board is to become paralyzed in terms of decision-making, or to take kind of a trade-off decisions that are not good for the left or the right. So for this, the business judgment rule has really to be recalled as a fundamental principle for the board that with the right information, with the right process, without conflict of interest, then the board is shielded. And then on the last question, yeah, we have described, each of us has described a more powerful, a more empowered board. Do we want a more empowered board? Two conditions, in my opinion: the board must add value, otherwise it doesn't happen, and the CEO has to accept it. And for the two dimensions, I think that the chair has a role by developing a positive trust relationship with the CEO and by developing a board culture and a board dynamics which is resulting into added value. I have the pleasure of experimenting some of these at SNAM. We'll be happy to share during the discussion later. I think it's possible. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. Obviously, the role of different ownership structures and different kind of shareholders matters. Just to remind you that next year we will also update, we are now updating, following the update of the corporate governance principles, the SOE, state-owned enterprise guidelines, which I think is another interesting issue, which I think we will finish during the Italian G7 presidency, but it will be also another important point. So now I would like to open the floor for discussion. So I welcome comments from all the discussants here, so reflecting on what the presenters or the panelists have said. So just raise your also the plate, and then so when I call you, speak in the mic, and then just limit the comments to a maximum of 2 minutes maximum. And so we start, I think, please. So
Thank you.
Hiromi from the
Yeah,
Japan
thank you.
Exchange, please.
I'm Hiromi Yamaji. I'm one of the CEOs of Japanese companies and Japan Exchange Group. And I would like to adapt a few comments about corporate governance reform in Japan and from the viewpoint of a market operator. We have been, my basic understanding is that, the good corporate governance is a kind of the foundation for an investable and attractive capital market. At the same time, a constructive dialogue between the companies and also investors is critical for companies' sustainable growth. And our role as the market operator is to set up the framework to facilitate those meaningful as well as constructive dialogue between companies and investors. JPX has been pushing forward corporate governance reform for more than 2 decades and reaching out to both investors and the companies. And rate of progress so far has been good. However, there is still room for improvement. And the next stage, I think, is to instill changes in the company's management mindset as well as the corporate culture. So as a first step, we made a request for Toby kindly introduced. We made a request for the listed companies to refocus on their cost of capital as well as the capital efficient management with enhanced disclosure, so that those listed companies can meet the responsibility of the listed companies and also shareholders' expectations. I think there are good signs of changes. So we hope that this will lead Japanese market. This will lead further development of the Japanese market. Other important issues of global themes, such like sustainability and diversity and also human capital, and also as well as I think we are going to expand NISA, which is a Japanese investment savings account, individual savings account. We expanded very much thanks to the Japanese government support, and also focus on the startup incubation in Japan will certainly bring more changes. So JPX, as a market operator, would like to continue to fully support the Japanese government as well as JFSA for their corporate governance reform. And also, we will take our own proactive actions as a market operator. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiromi. Yagi Takeyuki from TUAC, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Yagi, a participant from TUAC, Trade Union Advisory Committee to OECD. We thank the leadership of the Japanese presidency of G7, OECD Secretary General Matthias Cormann, and Masato Kanda, Chair of OECD Corporate Governance Committee. Also, we welcome the opportunity to participate in this important meeting on behalf of TUAC and the Labor 7, the official engagement group representing trade unions at G7 level. I would like to add on another aspect. Could you please pay your attention that the leaders, Labor 7 has adopted a statement that is downloaded from TUAC website, calling upon the G7 members to foster social cohesion, uphold workers' rights, and tackling inequalities in these times of multiple crises and uncertainty. Corporate governance plays a critical role in this region. We would like emphasis on workers and trade unions being central to any corporation's capacity to abolish sudden shocks, adapt to new circumstances, and have the eligibility to transform. So we call on G7 members to pursue the efforts in line with the statement made last year by G7 leaders to cooperate to maximize the coherence implementation of and the compliance with international standards relating to human rights, environment, and labor across global supply chains, and to reduce the environmental impact and promote decent work through a mix of binding and non-binding measures. In this region, The Labor 7 reaffirmed the need of mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence in global value chains and call for the adaptations of an international treaty setting a common global legal framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yagi. So Jay Surti from the IMF.
Good evening, and thank you very much for this opportunity to participate at this roundtable. I just wanted to start by reiterating the IMF's strong support of the review and strengthening of the G20 OECD corporate governance principles. The revised principles will help to improve the legal, regulatory, and institutional frameworks for corporate governance of publicly traded companies, which is essential to supporting growth and financial stability. I wanted to make 3 specific points. First, we welcome the chapter dedicated to sustainability and resilience issues, and appreciate that the proposals reflect the latest development in international financial standards while aligning concepts with the spirit of the principles. In particular, we would like to express support to guidance covering disclosures, transition planning, and risk management. Second, an adequate emphasis on emerging market perspectives has significant merit in our view. Corporate governance concerns prevalent in emerging markets tend to more routinely deal with horizontal agency problems, such as the abuse of minority shareholders by promoters, when compared to vertical agency problems that are more prominent in advanced economies. Third, and finally, we view as vital the enhanced requirements for disclosure and transparency of company ownership and group structures, as well as the strengthened requirements for transactions with related parties. Our work with our membership, notably through the financial sector assessment programs that we do jointly with the World Bank, have found that related party transactions have potential to be unfair, abusive, fraudulent, ultimately posing risks to financial stability and integrity.
Thank you, Jill, also for all the support of the IMF and in working on the revisional principle. And John Schlinder, Secretary General of FSB.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers for inviting the FSB to this. I think often the link between corporate governance and financial stability might not be as obvious as the link between financial stability and a money fund that breaks the buck, or the emergence of a new asset class like crypto assets. But I think some people have emphasized, I think Luca emphasized it very clearly, the recent banking turmoil, the corporate governance, the risk management frameworks played an important role. And we can look at other events like the FTX implosion of however many months ago and the role that corporate governance played there, or Archegos. This is not news to FSB members, which have been working on corporate governance issues since the FSB was created about 14 years ago. Because a key lesson, I think this was also brought up earlier by Masato, of the global financial crisis, a key lesson was the importance of effective conduct, culture, and risk management practices. As a result, let me just highlight a few of the things the FSB has been doing in this area and emphasize that we're still doing it. In 2014, the FSB released a framework for supervisors to assist them in their assessment of risk culture at financial institutions. I think Masato emphasized in his slides that in 2015, the FSB plenary and its members endorsed the OECD principles. And that's because of the importance of corporate governance for a sound financial system. And the FSB has had a group on compensation practices, executive compensation practices, since its inception. That group released a report just earlier this year linking climate targets and climate incentives to those compensation practices and the effects on financial stability. So corporate governance may not get as much attention as crypto or climate or money market funds when it comes to financial stability, but it remains on the FSB's agenda. Thanks.
Thank you, John, and also for, again, the work that we have been conducting together, also with a common aim. So Hiroki Sanpei, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Hiroki Sanpei. I would like to share my thoughts from the global investor point of view and the Japan context. First, I'm very grateful to hear the committee reviewed and the revised the corporate governance principles. But I think there's the important thing at the high level, that is agreeing the purpose. Why do we do it? And values. What values should we need to share globally? On values, with regard to the main agenda, how corporate governance can support corporation sustainability and resilience. It is important to change the viewpoint from less constructive dichotomy of opinion to move constructive thinking. For example, the following arguments are often seen in Japan. What is the right balance of the two, or what dichotomy between the two? Shareholder versus stakeholders, financial versus non-financial, economic value versus social value, financial return versus social return. This way of thinking is based on dichotomy and trade-off between the two. However, in real world, there are two sides of the same coin, particularly in long term. Important basis of sharing the values, I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion must be a core value. Then we can be more creative and design new business models to avoid negative externalities for sustainability and to strengthen financial capital for resilience at the same time. Those are the basic values we need to share. Otherwise, the details of the principles may not work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Alicia Ogawa, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the honor and the pleasure to be here today. I was very delighted to, well, I've known for a long time how important Inoue-san feels it is to address the topic of stewardships, which you highlighted on this slide. I think that I should mention I am an advisor on Japan to two of the biggest global activist funds, and I serve on the board of two Japan-focused activist funds. And I think all of the people I deal with and my U.S. colleagues here today, J.C. Deswan, Mr. Matsura, Toby and his associate Makino-san, it's something that we talk about all the time, that there are many issues you could point to which would improve Japanese corporate governance, but the better stewardship, particularly by domestic asset managers, is really the thing that would move the needle most. It's certainly true that the big three US-based passive funds have their own challenges with governance, not only in Japan but the rest of the world. But I think in Japan, the stewardship as a concept is hampered by some real specific disadvantages. One is the role of pension funds. Whenever I go to events run by Kerry's organization or Council of Institutional Investors or others, the thing that is so impressive is the number of people who are on the stage representing pension funds and the enthusiasm and the passion of their engagement on the issues that they identify as priorities for their beneficiaries. In Japan, there is a special situation of GPAF, which is not really an active steward. We can put that aside, and the issues that Toby identified with the Bank of Japan's holding of 8% of the market. But certainly the corporate pension funds in Japan have no excuse for essentially stealing money from their beneficiaries, and I would like to see them held to a higher standard. The second disadvantage is some of the issues around the domestic asset management industry, which suffer from the same human capital management challenges that other Japanese companies face, which is the lack of incentivized compensation system, the rotation system for management, so that specialization is difficult. But I was so glad that Yamaji-san mentioned NISA. I don't hear this mentioned often enough. The Prime Minister Kishida's plan for doubling asset income ownership in Japan could be the key thing. One of the challenges for Japanese asset managers' stewardship activities is that they don't have the same huge revenue base that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street have from the retail industry. And so if the NISA plan is successful, I think that that could be a fantastic catalyst for better stewardship or more resources for better stewardship among the domestic asset managers. And lastly, I would just say, it's strange to me that there is no political spokesperson for better stewardship, better investor protection, better, for lack of a better word, better champion of a Japanese capitalism style. You know, maybe it is time for such an advisor. I would hate to see Inoue-san be removed from the FSA, but I think that having one particular advisor or spokesperson to speak to the importance of investor education, of stewardship, of the role of asset manager in creating a stable and progressive and prosperous Japan, it's time for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. I was seeing that Masamichi was nodding, so maybe he can be the spokesperson. Masamichi Kono, please.
It's such a great honor, but thank you, Carmine. Great pleasure to be here. And I am Masa Kono, former Deputy Secretary General of the OECD. Thank you, Matthias, for coming over a long way. And former FSB member, and also now advising MHC Bank and trustee of the iFirst Foundation. Now, I would like to really thank and commend everyone who worked on the revision of the OECD corporate governance principles and also on the review of the corporate governance code in Japan. And certainly those revised principles and the action program will be extremely useful for corporates to really take forward their work in improving their corporate governance framework and upgrade the practice. But I must say, we can't take the effective implementation of those instruments and measures for granted. And so if we look at all those recent failures of corporate governance in financial and non-financial firms, large and small, there's really an absolute need to foster the right corporate culture that would not only promote, of course, enterprise value, but also put an end to a recurrence of corporate fraud and misbehavior, and which would certainly promote integrity and transparency. And there needs to be the right incentives, but there needs really to be this corporate culture that must be fostered. Now, this importance of corporate culture, by the way, is already enshrined in Principle 2 of the Japanese Corporate Governance Code. So, and I think this is implicit in all the work that has ensued the issuance of this code. And so, importance of culture. But then, as a trustee of the iFirst Foundation, I must add that we really need credible, consistent, and comparable corporate disclosure. And in this regard, what we're doing at the iFirst Foundation is to develop those global sustainability disclosure standards to be issued by the end of June, which is very soon. And only when we do have those credible, consistent, and comparable disclosure and reporting by corporate entities implemented effectively across jurisdictions can we really have a meaningful dialogue between investors and investing firms, and certainly corporate governance will be enhanced. So thank you for this opportunity, and I would really like to seek your full support for the ISSB work. Thank you.
Thank you, Masa, also for all the work you have done in the recent years, because I think that this revision also owes a lot to you. And also, I think the revision, an important person was Dan Koningsberg. He's the chair for the BIAC Corporate Governance Committee, and so important institutional stakeholder of the OECD who has followed this process, but also the recent one. So, Dan.
Thank you, Carmine. Yes, I do. I wear a couple hats today. I'm chair of the BIAC business at the OECD committee. We're, in a sense, the patient on the table being operated on, but I'm also an ICGN board member, and I lead corporate governance in our boardroom practice globally for Deloitte. I have three quick takeaways. Takeaway one is that the world and Japan needs to focus, when it thinks about governance, on substance and not form. You've heard this, I'm sure, from many people. But it seems to me that when we talk about what's happening in Japan in particular today, but this is for a lot of countries, but for Japan, whether a company has a kansaiyaku system on the one hand, or whether it has a board with committee system on the other, it seems to me that matters much, much less than whether that board is independent of management and can it really constructively challenge management to run the company in a long-term sustainable way. That's, I think, a much more difficult question. It's seductive, I think, to look at some of these technical structural questions, but the more substantive question is there right in front of us. My second takeaway is that Japan and the world needs to have more independent and better independent directors who understand the business, directors who can credibly oversee the business, and who can be a sounding board to management. This is not easy to do. It's a hard balance to strike, and I think Japan needs both. These directors need to be, can I suggest, we need more women, we need more foreign directors, we need more professionalized directors too. To me, I think, Monica, it was your point that really struck home to me. I think we should ask ourselves, do we really want that more empowered board here? You be careful what you wish for, in a way. If you get it and they're not competent, or if you get it and CEO is not supportive, you will have a much bigger problem than you have today. And my third and last point is a word that has not come up so far, strangely, and that is trust. Business at the OECD and Deloitte believe strongly that higher levels of trust are an overriding benefit of sound corporate governance. Today, we struggle with trust. Trust in institutions, trust in companies, trust in the markets as a whole. Trust is critical when you're accessing capital, and it's critical to obtaining support from your employees, your communities, the larger society that I know Japan cares much more about. So to me, we've got to look at this. Any governance reform in Japan should consider its effect on trust. And finally, let me suggest, because I am here as an ICGN board member as well, we have to bring together these two wonderful reference points for corporate governance. The OECD principles, which are the single reference point for policymakers, and the ICGN governance principles, which are the single globally recognized reference point for companies coming from the world's largest investor organization. Deloitte and business at the OECD and ICGN stand ready to help make Japan a model of corporate governance for the rest of the world. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Dan. Always very, very clear and to the point. Neil.
Thank you, Komine, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate. Yes, Neil Akers from MSCI. Firstly, I just want to put Toby at comfort and at ease. I don't take offense at his comments and very much agree that index providers aren't fiduciaries. So a point of dispute has been resolved in a couple of minutes. Secondly, as a leading provider of ESG ratings, we take governance as a key cornerstone of what we do when we assess companies. And obviously, the OECD principles form a key cornerstone of what we look at when we create and develop our governance methodology. So we welcome the refreshment of the principles and updating of the approach in terms of which has been followed. If I can offer one example where we think the principles are going to help quite substantially is a gap that we currently see where there is a significant lag in terms of skills and diversity of skills on the board versus emerging risks. We took a look at the constituents of our global cap market index, where we found that less than 10% of constituents had at least one director who had any knowledge of climate risk in terms of a management portfolio. If you have that and you take Secretary General's comments earlier about the material risk that climate risk is introducing into the markets, a much higher and substantial amount of those constituents are exposed to climate risk than they have expertise on the board level. And so the work of the OECD and the revised principles, which places a focus on the sustainability concept, is going to bring that into the boardroom and hopefully increase the diversity of skills for these new and emerging risks, not only on climate, but as others risks develop, such as digital assets and the like. So thank you.
Thank you. Very good point. And again, competence and expertise, which is an evolving, dynamic issue, I think is very important. Mike Lubrano, and now I'm going backwards.
I hope that you're not going backwards by. My name is Mike.
Depends on you.
Thank you very much, Carmine. My name is Mike Lebrano, and in various capacities, I've been involved in the regional roundtables of the OECD since the first one in 2000. And I wanted to say that from the perspective of investors in emerging markets, in particular, I believe that the revision's more explicit and direct treatment of company groups will be a welcome contribution to increasing the principles' practical application in those markets. The revisions now more fully reflect that markets dominated by broadly dispersed ownership and independent companies are more actually the exception than the rule. And I'd also like to highlight that the principles recognize that while companies in groups deviate in important respects from the classic model of corporate governance of the firm, and therefore raise special challenges for policymakers, that doesn't make company groups or companies in groups inherently a bad thing. In fact, on the contrary, company groups have very many legitimate purposes and can achieve real economic benefits for society through scale, synergies, and other efficiencies. I believe that especially in the emerging markets context, where financial systems are frequently less effective and efficient and private infrastructure is often constrained, the principles approach to company groups is the correct one. Public policy and regulation should be neutral in regards to company groups and neither tip the scale for or against group structures. Rather, regulators should, as the OECD principles now reflects, be attuned to the special challenges that company groups typically present for capital markets and economies, such as allocation of capital in ways that are not necessarily in the interests of all shareholders, inadequate transparency around ultimate control, and abusive related party transactions, and that they should respond, regulators and policymakers, in ways that are tailored to the conditions in their particular market, again, without serving to unduly disadvantage legitimate objectives and structures of company groups. I feel that the revised principles also recognize that in many cases, company groups transcend borders, and hence the principles themselves now call for domestic regulators to cooperate with their counterparts in other jurisdictions to gain a fuller understanding of the complete picture of the governance of the groups that they oversee and to coordinate their responses. So I would like to, my takeaway from this, I'd like to encourage the OECD to intensify its work in the area of company groups, especially as part of the regional roundtables. The revised principles and the work that the OECD has already done, the leadership role is taken on this topic, mean that this is, the OECD is, the international organization that is especially well placed to play a leading role in helping these domestic regulators develop informed and effective approaches and to cooperate across boundaries. And thanks for inviting me, Carmine.
Thanks, Mike. Actually, I think you, but also the principle moved forward, and you notice this part, the new part on company groups, which I think is quite relevant, and also the approach. I mean, there's nothing good or bad in principle, but then there are obviously some I think, new suggestion, advice, recommendation in terms of for the groups which are quite relevant. Flow of information, others. Naomi, please. You are also a patient, you know, on the table, because Sony Corporation and also Business Federation in Japan. Please.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and also my fellow colleagues here. I will not repeat on behalf of Keidan and what we have said in our public statements, but just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone, including especially the FSA, with whom we have been working very closely on the governance principle reform for the past over a year, and also the members of the various committees that have worked hard to change that. All the points that have been made here were very, very interesting and valid. But from a corporate perspective, it is important that we do pursue substance than form, which is the comment that someone made earlier. And I think corporates do appreciate that engagement is important. But there is also some structural laws, regulation issues that need to be resolved and also reformed. And there is the big issue of resource and education. board members the resource required to fulfill the disclosure requirements, which need to be built. So it will be a journey, and corporates are obviously trying and will work harder towards that goal. And so we would appreciate your patience, and also if we could work together with us in order to build the expertise to pursue the agenda that we both, I think, or we all are trying to pursue here. And so thank you very much again for all your cooperation so far and also going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Jaime Matsura, so another portfolio manager. So let's see from your point of view.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us. We are very excited, and I would like to talk about two topics. By the way, LIM Advisors, we're a multi-strategy fund, including investment. We run a Japan fund, mainly focusing on the G part of ESG. When we invest in a company in Japan, and when we do have to exercise our shareholder rights, we always make sure that we are interested aligned to that of other stakeholders. That being said, I'd like to talk about two topics. The first topic is something about very personal. I started my professional career as a news reporter covering this kind of event in the 90s, back in the 90s in Tokyo. In the 90s, it was very hectic, I'm afraid, because every day was 2008 or 2009. In other words, always talking about the risk of systemic risk. Another day, we talk about how to cure companies from corporate scandals. That took place, and fast move forward, like 20 years later, finally having taken care of all those topics, we're talking about how to use the market mechanism for the growth for the economy. This is fantastic, and as a witness of this story of so-called lost decades, I'm very enthusiastic and very bullish about the future of Japan. And there is a phrase in our side, buy side, that we were never allowed to say. It's called, "This time is different." But I think this time is different. And I would like to congratulate the Japanese government, especially namely FSA, for spearheading to develop this topic. That's the first thing I would like to mention. The second issue is I was very intrigued by the second pillar of the new chapters OECD is try to revise, which is, let me repeat, board responsibilities, clarify that material sustainability risks and opportunities must be considered by the board, and highlight the importance of the business judgment rule for long-term investments. A country like Japan, where we have a statutory law, we're not a case law country, just like a continent. So it really, the definition of business judgment is pretty much murky, and sometimes being abused by the management. So I would highly encourage the OECD team to delve into this topic and embody this, the definition of business judgment rule. Thank you. And if that should happen next year, I will quote this phrase to file shareholder proposal.
I mean, this is a great food for thought. You can't imagine also on a much simpler topic how the discussion, is being on the wording and evolving. But I think this is obviously a big issue, and that's why we need international standards that are for. Carl, if here, please.
Oops. Carl Renner from the International Forum for Independent Audit Regulators. Many thanks for the invitation to be here today. We're very supportive of your update to your corporate governance principles, and very grateful for your reference to IFIA's principles in there on independent audit regulation. One of the key aspects, though, that we really appreciate your emphasis on is that key role of audit committees, and the key role they play in overseeing management and its reporting and its controls and processes, in appointing and reappointing the auditors and overseeing the role of the auditors. And we really would like to emphasize that role role of the audit committees in appointing auditors should be based on quality and information that's available publicly on the quality of the work being done by the auditors, and not based on price. And finally, I'd like to remind everybody of the key and important role that auditors play in providing that trust to the market on the information provided by the corporate management, and on the key role that my members play in overseeing auditors to hold them to account to ensure they're doing their role properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I think that obviously the principles, as you acknowledge and recognize the important role that auditors have, and also in the evolving framework. JC, please.
Great, thank you. By way of introduction, I divide my time between Cornwall Capital, which is a New York-based global fund, and the economics department at Princeton. And so, I think we tend to look at corporate governance, of course, in terms of what else needs to be done. But I want to give credit to the Japanese government and the FSA in particular, and echo what Hajime Matsuura said. We're a global fund. There's no particular reason for us to be in Japan. And we started investing here in 2013 specifically because of the corporate governance reforms. And today, in the last several years, Japan has been by far the majority of our investment activity. And it's been fascinating to see the evolution, right? So we tend to focus on medium-sized companies. And when we started investing in 2013, we'd go to these companies, bring up the corporate governance code, which hadn't come out, of course, yet, right? We knew there were going to be corporate governance reforms. And the companies were, we have no idea what you're talking about, right? 2015, once the stewardship code and the corporate governance code had come out, we would have these same conversations, and they would say, oh yeah, we've heard about it, we'll take a look. But it was still very much, there wasn't that much traction. And I would say it's by 2018 that we started not only having real conversations with companies where they were ready to engage, but they would proactively bring it up to us. And so there's been an enormous amount of progress. And the reality is that, when they started, a lot of close observers said, never in Japan, right? We're never going to, corporate governance reforms would never gain traction in Japan. And the other thing I would say is that there was a lot of concern that these corporate governance reforms would die with a change in administration. And that has absolutely not been the case. And in fact, we've been tremendously comforted by the fact that there have been multiple revisions to the code, and there's constant deep work that is being done regarding what else needs to be done, right? Now, of course, there is a lot to be done. I would certainly back what Alicia Ogawa said in terms of the critical importance of domestic funds in terms of moving the dial here and their adherence to the stewardship code. Certainly, bolstering the independence of board directors, and I think there are ways to be innovative. And perhaps even focus on things like dissent, right? Monitoring dissent. Things like, I do think that institutionalizing board member training is critical. There are a lot of situations in which we interact with board members and realize they don't fully understand their role on the board. And so that's important. I do think in Japan specifically, there's a special case of parent subsidiary structures that have been vexingly resilient in a way. And the government is focused on this, but we still have them, and those typically are very vulnerable from a corporate governance perspective. And finally, I would say from our perspective, there's no metric in a sense that is more reflective of how far you have gone than the market for corporate control, right? The more you see M&A, the more vibrant the market is, because typically the absence of M&A suggests that there are constraints that are linked to corporate governance failures. And that, to me, in a sense, is an important thing for the Japanese market to focus going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all these points, and also the last one in particular. Ryoko, please. Ueda.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for OECD for this opportunity and for Japan FSA and Japan government of Japan. So actually, I'm a university professor now, but I had 20 years career at the financial institute as a bridge between companies and investors. So actually, I also I really surprised that Japan is one of the leading country in corporate governance. So actually 10 years ago, I submitted a report when I was young about the Japanese fact of corporate governance. 10 years ago, Japan was really, really behind. Actually, we are supporting the corporate governance roundtable in Asia, but we are just catching up. But now we can't read the discussion. It is my pleasure as well. So, but I think in the Japanese corporate governance code, sustainability was already written firstly, I think, from the first stage. And now, as a OECD and global level, sustainability is a very big issue for company and for investors as well. However, when I talk with a company, the sustainability, I think, as some person mentioned, I think that sustainability should not be only one single goal. The sustainability in the business area or in the industry area, the sustainability is just one of the purpose to achieve the full return from the investment and from the business operations. So I think we have to think about the sustainability and corporate governance in the economic meaning, not only the social meaning. So I think it's one point. And I want to speak about the second point. The second point is ethics. So actually, I am a member of the FSA's, Japanese FSA's follow-up council with Kerry and with Higashihara-san. And I attended the last council meetings. Higashihara-san and another company management mentioned about the ethics. So in Japan, the corporate governance code was very successful. So many companies introduced number of outside directors and diversity and women directors like me. However, it's very detailed. I think the formality is important as a first step, but the final goal or final purpose is the quality of corporate governance. So I think we have to think more about the what is before the corporate governance formality. I think it's a kind of ethics or the philosophy or culture, the culture of the company or the culture of the investors as well. So I think we have to think, we have to have the more big view towards the corporate governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bruce?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a university academic. I'm not representing any organization, just myself. I have studied Japanese corporate governance and comparative corporate governance for some time, and I echo some favorable comments from the other panelists here that the two codes have made a difference in Japan and their corporate governance has been improving substantially, although still a bit more to go. On a personal note, until last year, for 5 years, I was an independent director at a Japanese company that is well known for having good corporate governance, the committee system, the chair of the board being an independent director, a majority of independent directors. And for 5 years, I participated in dialogue with domestic institutional investors in Japan, which is unusual for outside directors of Japanese companies. So when people ask me what should we look for good corporate governance in Japanese companies, a dozen years ago I would have said ask to talk to the CFO, because at that time many companies had someone who just administered budgets to different departments but had no real capital policy and was not strategic in utilizing capital. And today I think the new frontier, many large Japanese companies have caught up with that one by now. I would say the new frontier that I was impressed by at my company was a very strong secretariat that was dedicated to supporting the board and particularly the independent directors, providing them the information means of communication with management when necessary, the means for proposals, using the chair, who's an independent director, if you need some agenda item put on the board or committee. It was relatively easy to accomplish. I also say generally, I think Monica doesn't have to worry about Japan yet. There's no danger that the boards will become too powerful here anytime in the near future. I would say the opposite. For good corporate governance in Japan, you first of all need a CEO who has a mindset that accepts that independent director should play a real role. And that's where we are today. I think, again, it's been improving, it's changing. And I often describe it as there should be a healthy tension between the management and the board. It's not good if the CEO doesn't worry what any of the board will say. If they've decided it at the executive committee meeting, then it's done. Well, it's not done. And they should know that it's not done. And I think leading companies in Japan, that's already happening fairly rapidly. And I guess finally, once I finished my 5 years of dialogue with institutional investors, one of them asked me, we've been doing this for 5 years, what do you have to say to us in our final meeting? And echoing the comments by a number of people today, okay, now Japanese companies have independent directors. What are they supposed to do? It's not like the US where they're essential, for example, for hostile takeover defenses, or they're essential to establish good business judgment in court decisions. There's no specific role like that. And so I said, what I would like the institutional investors to do is to think more about what specifically do you expect from independent directors and what is their role? And I know that the FSA and many people are focused on that now. I don't know that there's an obvious answer, but I think that's one of the important areas that we need to work on, and the OECD efforts and the principles, I think, are very useful in helping the Japanese on their way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. Maybe Toshiaki, you can tell us what independent directors are doing in Hitachi or something.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm Executive Chairman of Hitachi, and now I'd like to share my concern in the future. Ryoko-san mentioned the ethical issue, but first I'd like to share my biggest concern is that Hitachi consists of the 12 board members, and 9 out of 12 is independent board. That's good. But a little bit concerned about lack of skill, lack of resources. For example, sustainable people who are very have a big good experience and know-how about sustainability or carbon neutrality or the circular economy or nature positive. It is very difficult to find such kind of skill person who has a skill, and this is the biggest. So I'd like to, if you recommend us to this is the ideal board member, please prepare for some resource pool to provide such kind of a specialist. This is one my concern. Second concern is this is the biggest concern. Ryoko-san mentioned ethics. This 6 months, I'm very, very concerned about the future our business taking into the AI. What shall I say? When Hitachi is one of the developer to what shall I say, system platform or a package by using AI, but how we should have the development policy with AI, and what we can contribute to the human well-being of society by using the AI, ChatGPT, for example. Who is the role of a human being? For instance, please consider the society in 2050. probably almost all our workplace replaced by the AI robot. Where is our place to work for human beings? So these kind of what shall I say, future design is very, very important for our company. And the board members, somebody mentioned board members should discuss about the short term and the long term, that's right. But we had better consider about the future society. And what is the role of the enterprise company? What is the role of the board member? This is my biggest concern. Please give me some idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Very important consideration. Now, we have time for 30 seconds. I will go in reverse order, panelists and then presenters, if they want to comment. Monica, you were quoted many times, so do we want stronger, boards or not, please?
So the question was rhetorical. I think we ask for it. The investor hold the board accountable, and we should do it. I think it's possible. It's a big change. It's a big change. I think going back to AI, the old style governance can be done by AI. So if it is only that, we just use AI, right?
Okay, I hope that the AI will not write your intervention as chair of SNAM in the future. Luca, please.
I tried last night to have ChatGPT do my 4 minutes. It didn't work at all.
Thank you, Luca. Toby.
I was told by a very smart person that AI will change everything. It can count from 1 to 10 faster than any human, but it takes a human to go from 0 to 1. And so as long as we live in the 0 to 1 and control our creativity, I think we're okay.
Thank you, Toby. Kerry.
Engage, engage, engage. It's all about constructive engagement between companies and investors, building trust. We're delighted with our relationship with Kay Danren and very much welcome the dialogue that we have. And disclose, disclose, disclose. The quality of disclosures needs to improve on both sides. Investors need to be disclosing better, and so do companies.
Thank you, Kerry. Toshitake.
Well, I would like to thank all the kind words to the FSA and Japanese government, but I understand we got a lot of homeworks to do. So I continue to, go along with a never-ending journey. Thank you.
Yeah, but I always say the rewards is proportional to the effort. So I think it's a long journey, as also with the principles and the work we have been doing a lot. But I think then you see the improvements. Patricia.
Thank you. I think for me an important takeaway is that governance matters, and certainly in my world it's not just corporate governance but institutions in general and the governance of those institutions. I see a real, symmetry between this discussion and the discussion that we have in thinking about governance in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Masato?
Thank you, Carmine. I really appreciate these guys' very profound wisdom and extremely useful suggestions, not only for our work for the revision of the OECD G20 principles on the corporate governance, and also beyond the thinking about the reforming our society to the better life and more sustainable one. And as for the well-being, coincidentally, tomorrow at the G7 ministerial meeting, we'll have a discussion on the definition of well-being, welfare, beyond GDP with Professor Joseph Stiglitz. And probably I may be able to incorporate your ideas to that discussion. Thank you very much indeed for your advice.
Thank you, Masato. I think that the well-being of corporations surely depends also on good corporate governance, and I think that in this sense the principles can be useful. Just to remind you that the principles is not a corporate governance code; they are addressed to policymakers and then implemented by different jurisdiction. And by the way, it's not only true addressed to listed companies, but actually, if you see Principle 1 is addressed to regulators, policymakers, and also dealing a lot with aspects that we have that can be parallel. For example, independence, but competence, and many of you dealt with it. I think the principles, as also Masato mentioned at the beginning, so the journey, I mean, we have done this journey, formally will be adopted by the ministerial at the OECD on June 7 and 8, and then hopefully at the G20, the finance minister meeting in July, and then the Leaders Summit. It's an important issue many of you expressed, and so I thank you a lot of support for the work and for the principles, many of you, and I think the process has been long but fruitful. I think it's important to have a dialogue. They're not coming only from, public authorities, from, delegations, but by a constant dialogue with market practitioners, issuers, investors, and I think that BIAC and TUAC, by the way, can testify this journey. This will be the first, actually, strong support I heard also, and Trish also, thank you, but many of you for this new chapter. Sometimes the form is as important as the substance, so this chapter 6, and this will be the first global, I would say, ambitious agreement on sustainability and disclosure. And it's true that maybe disclosure is not an end in itself, but disclosure is very important. And through also disclosure, you have incentive to have a better and behaviors and sustainability, more and more important roles of stakeholders, not only to pure shareholders. So I think is a very important revision. And Kerry, you were saying the usual thing, one size does not fit all. I revert these. This is true. At the same time, I always say not one size, but fit for all. And I think a good corporate governance, I think, is fit for everyone. So this concludes the open discussion. So now, to close the roundtable, we have Parliamentary Vice Minister Eikei Suzuki will deliver remarks. So let's welcome him with a round of applause.
Thank you very much for joining us and for providing your rich insights on corporate governance. It is a privilege and honor to bring together leaders in various fields. The roundtable had fruitful discussions around two key topics. First, OECD Secretary General Coleman and Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs Kanda introduced the review of the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance, the single global standard in the area of corporate governance. In the changing socio-economic environment following the COVID-19 crisis, the development of a corporate governance framework that contributes to the sustainable growth and resilience of companies has become a global priority. Another important challenge is how to enhance the engagement of large institutional investors given the growing popularity of index investment strategies. As discussed today, the review of the G20 OECD corporate governance principles will address a broad set of these global challenges, and I would say the review is very timely. I expect that this review will provide practical guidance for advancing corporate governance reforms worldwide. Second, Mr. Inoue presented the progress on corporate governance reforms in Japan and described the action program established to secure more effective corporate governance in the country. In addition, Ms. Pollard and other participants shared corporate governance initiatives in their own countries, providing a good opportunity to exchange views. Japan has long been committed to corporate governance reforms as one of its key policies. As mentioned by Minister Suzuki and Mr. Inoue, reforms over the past decade have boosted corporate governance and changed the mindset of management across Japanese companies. Building on these reforms, we need to further transform corporate governance from form to substance and translate it into higher corporate values. To this end, it is important to encourage constructive dialogue between companies and investors and foster an environment where they can take initiatives
and instill corporate governance to raise corporate values. I hope that Japan's efforts will serve as a good model for other jurisdictions. Japan will continue its work to achieve effective corporate governance reforms. I am confident that today's lively discussions have contributed to global corporate governance reforms. I look forward to continuing the discussion by sharing experiences and challenges across countries and organizations, and by reflecting on the views of a wide range of market participants. Last but not least, I would like to conclude by wishing all of you continuing good health and happiness, as well as further progress on global corporate governance reforms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice Minister Suzuki. I think that the corporate governance of the Corporate Governance Roundtable has been quite effective, because we really finish on time. Actually, maybe 1 minute, so I need. I think I may have a bonus. And but I want to thank actually all of you. I mean, okay, we had our distinguished speakers at the beginning, Masato, the panelists, the presenters, all of you here, also the people from the delegation and in the audience, actually also the people who are following us live, because this is broadcasted through our channels. I want to thank in particular Masato for your also leadership at the Corporate Governance Committee, and I think that the review is very important. It was very challenging, but again, reward is proportional to the effort also on our side, and I think we have done a great job. We couldn't have done without also the OECD, and I've just arrived, so it's not my merit, but I mean, Serdar Selik is there, the head of Capital Markets Division. And also thank to all the people who have worked also for this roundtable, so the people, the staff, also people from the OECD, Akiko, but also the people from GFSA, Kent and the others. So thanks also for all the support and the ministry. So thank you really very much. So, I mean, an applause to all of you. And then just some, I